So if men were angels, my Uncle Jim would have sprouted wings years ago, you know. Watching that video, I've got the great privilege to present the inaugural James L. Buckley Award to my Uncle Jim. Watching that video was just amazing. They're 50. My Uncle Jim has 50 nieces and nephews, and I was one of the very little ones. I think third from the bottom. And that 1970 election, just seeing parts of that, just brought so many memories. I was sitting there and I kept thinking of striped pajamas. They used to do pajamas and they give you a little ball that came with it. And I held that ball in 1970 trying to stay awake as long as I could for the results of that election. And they told, go to bed, you're never going to make it. And they were right, But I had no doubt that my Uncle Jim was going to win. I think I know Jim Buckley shows that one can be both gentle and made of iron. Today, so many times you think the angriest conservative is the one to follow. It's really the one that sticks with principle. I was so proud. I mean, I've been so proud my whole life to hear about your endeavors. I just remember little blips from over the years that would come across the radio where you were in the Senate or elsewhere. You were always doing courageous things. I mean, I just jotted a couple of down. I mean, calling on President Nixon to resign. You were the first one. I mean, that was an incredibly difficult thing to do, which I could only appreciate now as an adult. Taiwan, you were the lone vote to stick against the Red Chinese. You're running for re-election and you voted against the bailout of New York City. I'm still flummoxed by that. That's extraordinary. The Human Life Amendment. There's so many things that you've done that are brave, and so it gives me great pleasure to give this award to one of the kindest and gentlest people that I've been blessed to know, uncles that I've been blessed to know, and also one of the most courageous. You're an American hero. You're an American hero, and there's no questioning that. So, Uncle Jim, can you come up and accept the original award? I'll try not to shatter it.
Now, I am so very touched. And also, when I saw, good Lord, this is Jack Fowler. How is that on top of that? I'm deeply touched, but after seeing, oh my Lord, I pulled the wrong thing out of it. After seeing that video, I wonder why I have anything to say. I think you made a lot of the points that I'm hoping to make tonight. But anyway, this is a touching moment. When I first heard that an award was to be established in my name, I thought it a rather bad idea. That the William F. Buckley Jr. program should create a James L. Buckley Award sounded all too incestuous. On reflection, however, I came to realize that the award isn't about me. Rather, it is yet another tribute to my remarkable brother's multiple powers. In this case, the power to transform other people's lives without even trying. I am merely a prime example of its exercise. Let me explain. Until the summer of 1965, I had lived a totally contented, interesting, and highly private life. Although I have always been interested in questions of public policy, I had never, ever had any thought of public service. Then something wholly unexpected happened. I received a telephone call from my brother Bill, in which he informed me that he had decided to run for the office of mayor of New York City, and furthermore, that I was to serve as his campaign manager. I told Bill that last was preposterous. I was far too busy with my own work, and furthermore, I knew absolutely nothing about politics, let alone managing political campaigns. Bill, though, as many people have found out, can be very persuasive. He explained, among other things, that as he could not possibly win, he didn't expect the race to take very much of his time. Therefore, it would take even less of mine. And that is how the leaders of New York's Conservative Party came to know of my existence. And 3 years later, when hunting around to fill a gap, they persuaded me to run as a pro forma candidate for the U.S. Senate, as it would be an unwinnable race against a popular liberal incumbent. They assured me that it would require little effort on my part. As it happens, it took a great deal of it, but I did surprisingly well. So 2 years later, yielding to a Boy Scout impulse to save the Republic, I ran again, this time with the hope of winning, which I did. Although rejected by an ungrateful electorate when I ran for re-election in 1976, by then I had become accustomed to the security of a federal payroll and soon found employment in the State Department and then the federal judiciary. Thus, that is how, thanks to Bill's telephone call, I ended up spending most of the rest of my working days in the writing, administration, or interpretation and application of federal laws. As a result, I have had more than the average citizen's opportunity to observe their impact on the lives of the people and the radical changes they have brought about on how we are governed. To illustrate the speed with which those changes have taken place, shortly after my election, I was handed a study of Congress that had concluded that the workload of the average congressional office had doubled every 5 years since 1935. Given the fact that in simpler times Congress worked at a leisurely pace and was in session 5 and 6 months a year, its members could take the initial increases in stride simply by devoting more hours per day and more months per year to their work. Over time, however, the available hours and months had been exhausted, and the doubling could only be accomplished by squeezing deliberation out of the legislative process. I can certify that during my own 6 years, I witnessed both a sharp increase in the already frenetic pace of the Senate and a decline in the ability to get very much done that could honestly be labeled thoughtful. The pressure cooker existence was the consequence of Congress's compulsion to scratch every itch on the body politic, whether it was its business or not. Beginning with the New Deal, the result has been an explosion of federal laws and regulations. In 1934, the United States Code consisted of a single volume of federal statutes, the work product of the Congress's first 137 years. But just 36 years later, when I was elected to the Senate, it had grown to 11 volumes. The current edition now contains 34. But those are just the tip of the governmental iceberg, because they are supplemented by an ever-expanding number of small print regulations that have the force of law and now fill 378 volumes. Those federal laws and regulations now reach into every corner of our lives, and those affected by them must now turn to their representatives in Washington for help with matters that were once handled at the state or municipal levels. All of these legislative and constituent pressures are converting Congress from an institution that could once think things through to responsible conclusions into one that substitutes political reflex for reflection. And to compound the injury, a harassed Congress now finds it so hard to focus on the messy details of new legislation that it increasingly abdicates its constitutional responsibilities by delegating essentially legislative authority to executive agencies, thereby spawning an unaccountable administrative state, an administrative state that issues letters instructing schools on who may use which bathroom without bothering with the pesky procedures that require the scrutiny of regulations before they are issued. An administrative state in which a president who is unable to persuade Congress to do his bidding now reaches for pen and phone to do his will. In my view, the serious problems we face these days are in major part the result of our abandonment of the Constitution's limits on federal authority. American independence was won and a republic created by a remarkable generation of men who turned to a rebellion against the British Crown into a transforming moment in human history, one based on the revolutionary proposition that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with fundamental rights that no government has the moral authority to set aside. But with the gaining of independence, the founders faced the formidable task of creating a government that would operate effectively while respecting and protecting the liberties for which the revolution had been fought. Excuse me. The architects of the American Revolution had no illusions about human nature, which is the one constant in human affairs. From their study of the history of free societies reaching back to ancient Greece, they understood that the drive to accumulate power, whether by an individual despot or a parliamentary majority, was the historic enemy of individual freedom. They therefore incorporated two safeguards into the Constitution: its system of separation of powers with its checks and balances, and the principle of federalism. In describing the latter, James Madison explained in the Federalist Papers that, quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state." During the debates over the Constitution's ratification, many expressed a concern that this allocation of responsibilities was not clear enough in the document itself. As a consequence, the first Congress made it explicit in the 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights, which provides that, quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." The 10th Amendment allocation of powers mirrors those of the venerable rule of subsidiarity, which assigns governmental responsibilities to the lowest level capable of handling them. Its effect is to decentralize political power and ensure, wherever feasible, that the decisions that most directly affect people will be made by officials who are the closest to them and most familiar with the relevant facts. This explicit division of governmental powers proved so effective that in a lecture on our Constitution, with which he found some significant flaws, the great British historian Lord Acton nevertheless concluded that, again I quote, "By the development of the principle of federalism, the American Constitution has produced a community more powerful, more prosperous, more intelligent, and more free than any other that the world has seen." During our first 140 years, Washington largely observed those limits. But with the advent of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, Congress began a wholesale assumption of the state's responsibilities. It found the authority to do so in an unfortunate Supreme Court decision that held that the Constitution's spending clause permits Congress to use federal funds to, quote, induce the states to adopt policies that the federal government itself has no authority to impose. To put it crudely, the court's decision has empowered Congress to bribe the states to adopt Washington's approach to matters that remain the state's exclusive business. Those grants and aids programs, which are laden with the most detailed instructions, now offer federal subsidies for virtually every activity in which states and local authorities are engaged and have made a major contribution to the federal government's vast expansion. In the process, they have converted the states in too many ways into mere administrators of programs created in Washington and overseen by bureaucrats who are the farthest removed from where the money is to be spent. In the process, they distort state priorities, impose ponderous regulations on a myriad state and local activities, and deprive their citizens of effective control over how their taxes are to be used. Congress has become addicted to these programs. There are now more than 1,000 of them, because they deal with matters that have the most immediate impact on their constituents' lives, such as housing, schooling, job training, potholes, you name it. Thus, their creation and the securing of grants offer its members their easiest means of rubbing elbows with the voters and generating the favorable headlines that will assure their reelection. As a consequence, whereas those programs distributed just $24 billion when I was elected, by 2015, that figure has reached almost $641 billion, or 1/6 of total federal spending, all for purposes that are none of Washington's business. And to compound the injury, instead of concentrating on the critical problems that only Congress can address, its members now devote a major portion of their time on matters that remain the exclusive responsibility of the states. In short, these programs have effectively nullified the 10th Amendment and in the process helped undermine Congress's ability to function effectively. But what can be done about it? 3 years ago, I had the temerity to write a book that the Buckley program was kind enough to distribute, And as I think it was mentioned earlier, it proposes a simple reform that would restore federalism and effect a major shrinkage of the federal government, namely the abolition of all of those programs. Needless to say, Congress has yet to act on my suggestion. I suspect that I have focused in excessive detail on the developments that are undermining our constitutional order. The question we face is, where do we go from here? The answer will depend on where the American people want us to go, and the language, notwithstanding the language and intent of the Constitution. The framers understood that the preservation of the liberties for which the American Revolution had been fought would require more than what James Madison referred to as the Constitution's parchment barriers. They recognized that in the last analysis, the Constitution's safeguards would be observed only so long as the public continued to understand and respect them. Unfortunately, over the past generation, our educators have abdicated their responsibility to ground their students in the fundamentals of the American enterprise. As a result, today's millennials, who will soon constitute our largest block of voters, are suffering from a peculiar form of historical amnesia. They remember all our sins, such as slavery and our treatment of the Indians, but few of them have any awareness of the constitutional and economic principles that, on the historical record, made ours the most productive, prosperous, innovative, generous, and free society that the world had seen. Principles that are responsible for the freedoms and material well-being they take so much for granted. In its brief history, the Buckley program has done a remarkable job of opening student minds and exposing them to those fundamental principles and demonstrating their relevance to the problems that plague us today. In the process, this program and others like it across the country that are focusing on the young are developing cadres of articulate young leaders who, in time, could have a real impact on the political world. For that, we are all indebted to Laura Noble for the inspiration in founding the Buckley program. And to all those whose contributions and participation have ensured its success. But so much needs to be done. When Benjamin Franklin was leaving Independence Hall on the final day of the Constitutional Convention, a woman approached him and asked, "Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" "A republic," he replied, "if you can keep it." If we can keep it. That is the challenge that every generation of Americans has been called upon to meet, one that underscores the importance of the work being done here at Yale by the Buckley program. In the meantime, however, a central question remains: how do we persuade Congress to operate within the limits of its authority while bringing the administrative state under effective control? Most fundamentally, how do we ensure the survival of the republic that Ben Franklin and the other founding fathers have entrusted to our care? That is the challenge we all face in the years immediately ahead, and too much is at stake for us to fail to do our best. In closing, I just want to say how deeply moved I am by the honor done me tonight, and how deeply I appreciate your presence here. God bless you all.